I didn't know the man who saved me that night was the reason no one else dared to touch me again. The rain had been falling for hours, the kind that turns city lights into blurred streaks of gold and red, the kind that makes everything feel a little more desperate than it already is. And I remember thinking my shift would never end, that my feet would give out before the clock hit midnight, that maybe if I just kept moving, kept smiling, kept pretending everything was fine, the world would leave me alone for one more night. I was wrong. Table 12 had been trouble from the moment they walked in. Loud voices, too much cologne, the kind of laughter that didn't sound like humor, but like a warning, and I tried to avoid them, tried to stay in the safer corners of the restaurant where the lighting was softer and the conversations were quieter, but tips mattered and rent didn't care about fear, so I stepped forward when my manager nodded, balancing the tray in my hands like it was the only thing keeping me steady. Another round. One of them said, his voice too close, his hand brushing my wrist just long enough to make my skin tighten, and I pulled back with a polite smile that felt glued to my face, the kind you learn to wear when saying no isn't an option, the kind that keeps things from escalating even when everything inside you is already bracing for impact. I told myself it would be quick, just a few seconds, just long enough to set the glasses down and walk away, but seconds stretch when you feel watched, when you feel cornered without walls, and I could feel it then, the shift in the room, subtle but real, like the air had changed direction. I didn't see him at first. I felt him. The silence came before the movement, a ripple through conversations, forks pausing midair, voices lowering without anyone being told to. And when I turned, tray still in my hands, I saw him standing near the edge of the room like he had always been there, like everything had been waiting for him to notice. He wasn't loud. He wasn't trying to be seen, but he was impossible to ignore. Dark suit, perfectly fitted, like it belonged to a different world then. The one I was working in, shoulders squared without tension, eyes steady and unreadable. And when those eyes landed on me, I forgot what I was about to say. Not because he was handsome, though he was, in that controlled, almost untouchable way, but because there was something else behind it, something that made every instinct in my body go still instead of running. Step back, he said, not to me, not directly, but the words carried anyway, low and even, like they didn't need volume to be obeyed, and the man at table 12 laughed at first, like it was a joke he didn't understand, like he hadn't realized the room had already chosen sides. Mind your business, he shot back, but his voice lacked the same certainty it had seconds before, and I saw it then. The smallest crack, the hesitation, the moment someone realizes they're no longer in control of the situation they thought they owned. I should have moved. I should have walked away and let whatever was about to happen unfold without me in it. But my feet didn't listen, and before I could decide anything, the man in the suit was closer, not fast, not rushed, just there, like distance didn't apply to him the same way it did to everyone else. His hand reached for mine, steadying the tray before it slipped. Fingers firm but careful, like he was holding something that mattered more than the moment itself. And for a second, everything else disappeared. The noise, the tension, the weight of the room pressing in on me. "Are you hurt?" he asked, and it was the first time anyone had asked me that all night. The first time it didn't feel like I was invisible in my own life. And I pulled my hand back too quickly, the reflex automatic, the words following before I could stop them. "I'm fine." It was a lie I'd practiced so well it almost sounded real. His gaze didn't change. Not softer, not harder. Just fixed, like he was reading something I hadn't said out loud. Behind him, the table had gone quiet, the earlier confidence replaced by something else, something closer to caution, and I didn't see what happened next. Not exactly, because it wasn't loud or dramatic or anything you could point to and say this is where it changed. But when I looked, again, the tension was gone. The table empty, like the problem had never existed in the first place. The room exhaled. Conversations returned. Glasses clinked again. Everything looked normal. But it wasn't, because he was still there, watching. And for reasons I didn't understand yet, the space around me felt different, like an invisible line had been drawn, like something had been decided without my permission. He didn't say anything else. Didn't ask for my name. Didn't wait for thanks. He just turned, slow and deliberate, like the night had already given him what he came for, and walked toward the door, the room shifting again as people moved out of his way without being asked. I stood there longer than I should have, tray still in my hands, heart beating a little too fast for something I couldn't explain, and I told myself it was over, that whatever that moment was, it didn't matter, that tomorrow would be the same as every other day. I didn't know then that it wasn't over, that it was just beginning. The next morning felt too quiet, like the city had decided to hold its breath, and I was the only one who noticed. And I kept replaying the night in my head while I walked the 6 blocks to the diner, where I picked up extra hours, trying to convince myself it had not meant anything, that men like him did not exist in my world long enough to matter, that whatever had happened was just a strange moment that would fade like everything else. But the memory would not let go, the way his voice had cut through the noise without rising, the way the room had shifted around him like gravity had changed direction, the way he had looked at me like I was not invisible, and I hated that it stayed with me, that it followed me into daylight like a shadow I could not shake. The morning crowd was easier, predictable, coffee orders and polite smiles, the kind of routine that usually grounded me. But even that felt different, like I was waiting for something I could not name, and I told myself it was just lack of sleep, just my mind holding on to something unusual, because everything else in my life was so painfully ordinary. But then I saw it. The envelope sat on the counter near the register, out of place against the worn wood and chipped corners, thick paper, expensive, the kind you only see in places that charge more for a single meal than I made in a day, and my name was written across the front in clean, deliberate handwriting. Emily. No last name. No explanation. Just my name like whoever left it already knew everything else. I stared at it longer than I should have, my fingers hovering just above it like touching it would make something real that I was not ready to face. And when I finally picked it up, it felt heavier than paper should, like it carried weight that had nothing to do with ounces or ink. Inside, there was no letter, no explanation, just a stack of bills, more than I had ever held at once, more than my rent for 3 months, and a single card tucked beneath it, black, simple, a number written in the same precise handwriting. No name, no company. Just a number. My chest tightened, not with relief, not with gratitude, but with something sharper, something closer to warning, because nothing like this came without a reason, and I had learned that lesson too many times to pretend otherwise. Where did you get that? My coworker asked, leaning over the counter, her voice low like we were already sharing a secret, and I closed the envelope before she could see more, shaking my head like it did not matter, like I could just tuck it away and keep my life exactly as it was. But I knew better, and so did she, because she did not push, just gave me a look that said be careful, without saying the words out loud. I told myself I would throw it away. I told myself I would not call the number. I told myself I did not need help from someone like him, that whatever protection he thought he was offering came with strings I was not willing to carry, but I did not throw it away, and I did not forget the number, and that was the first mistake I made. The second came later that night. My shift ended just after 10, the sky already dark, the streetlights casting long reflections across the wet pavement from another passing storm, and I wrapped my jacket tighter around me as I stepped outside, the familiar chill settling into my bones, the kind that comes from more than just cold air, the kind that comes from walking alone when you know no one is waiting for you at the other end. I kept my head down, my pace steady, counting steps like I always did, 1 block, then 2. Then 3, routine keeping me focused, keeping me from thinking too much, but halfway down the 4th block, I felt it again, that same shift in the air from the night before, that quiet awareness that something was not right even if nothing looked out of place. I told myself not to turn around. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself I was letting one strange encounter rewrite how I saw the world, but my instincts had kept me safe this long, and ignoring them felt like stepping into traffic with my eyes closed. So I slowed, just slightly, enough to listen, enough to feel the rhythm of footsteps that were not mine, steady, measured, not rushing, not hiding, just there, like they had every right to be, and my heart picked up in a way I could not control, my fingers tightening around the strap of my bag as I calculated distance, streetlights, open stores, anything that might give me options if I needed them. Then the footsteps stopped. Just like that. No warning. No explanation. The silence that followed felt louder than the sound had been, and before I could decide what to do next, a car pulled up to the curb beside me, smooth, quiet, Too expensive for this part of the city, the kind of car that did not belong on streets like mine, and I did not need to see the door open to know who it was. Get in, his voice said from inside, calm, controlled, like he was offering a simple solution to a problem I had not fully understood yet, and I shook my head immediately, stepping back, the instinct automatic, the refusal already forming before he could say anything else. I am fine, I said again, the same lie, the same shield, but it sounded weaker this time, thinner, like even I did not believe it anymore. The door opened anyway, not forceful, not rushed, just inevitable. You are not, he replied, and when I looked at him, really looked this time, I saw something I had missed before, not just power, not just control, but certainty, the kind that does not come from guessing, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what is coming next. You were followed for 2 blocks, he added quietly, like he was stating a fact I should have already understood, and my stomach dropped as the pieces clicked into place, the footsteps, the silence, the way the night had felt just a little too still. And if you keep pretending you do not need help, he continued, his eyes steady on mine, next time I might not be there to ask. I should have walked away. That is what I tell myself every time I think back to that moment, standing on the edge of the sidewalk with the cold air pressing against my skin and his voice cutting through everything I thought I understood about control, about distance, about safety, because getting into that car meant crossing a line I could not uncross, and I knew it. I felt it in the way my heartbeat refused to slow, in the way my instincts pulled in 2 different directions at once, one telling me to run, the other telling me I had already been seen too clearly to pretend I could disappear. I did not ask for this, I said, the words sharper than I expected, like pushing back might restore something I had already started to lose, but he did not react the way other people did when challenged. There was no irritation, no shift in posture, just that same stillness that made everything around him feel quieter than it should. No, he agreed, and for a second that caught me off guard, because agreement was not what I expected, but that does not change what is happening. His certainty unsettled me more than if he had argued, more than if he had tried to convince me, because it left no space for negotiation, only acknowledgement, and I realized then that whatever world he operated in did not wait for permission. I glanced down the street, half expecting to see someone, anyone, who might ground me back in something normal, but the sidewalk stretched empty under the streetlights, the distant hum of traffic too far away to matter, and the silence behind me felt heavier than it had a minute ago, like something unseen had shifted again. Something I could not ignore this time. 5 minutes, he said, his voice lower now, not softer, just closer, like he understood exactly how much time I needed to decide. If you still want to walk away after that, I will not stop you. I searched his face for doubt, for anything that suggested this was just another kind of pressure, another way of cornering me without making it obvious. But I did not find it, and that unsettled me more than anything else, because it meant the choice was real, and real choices are harder to refuse than forced ones. My fingers tightened around my bag, the strap pressing into my palm as I weighed something I could not fully define, and then, before I could overthink it, before I could talk myself back into the illusion of control I had been clinging to, I stepped forward and got into the car. The door closed with a quiet finality that echoed louder in my chest than it should have, and for a second, I just sat there, aware of everything at once, the soft leather beneath my hands, the faint scent of something expensive and unfamiliar, the way the world outside suddenly felt distant, like I had stepped into a different version of the same city. He did not speak right away. Neither did I. The car moved smoothly, pulling away from the curb without hesitation, and I watched the streetlights blur past the window, counting them like I always did when I needed to steady myself. 1, 2, 3, but it did not help this time, because the silence inside the car was not empty. It was deliberate, like he was giving me space to process something I had not fully accepted yet. You said I was followed, I finally said, breaking the quiet because I could not sit in it any longer, and he nodded once, his attention still forward, like the answer was already settled. 2 men, he replied, not random. The words settled heavily, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just precise, and that made them harder to dismiss. How do you know that? I asked, and this time he turned slightly, just enough for me to catch the edge of his expression, calm, measured, like the question itself was expected. Because I know who is looking for me, he said, and something in the way he said it shifted the weight of everything that had happened, like the pieces I had been trying to understand suddenly rearranged into something clearer, something more dangerous than I had allowed myself to consider. And now, he added, his voice steady, they have seen you. My breath caught, not from fear exactly, but from the realization that this was no longer just about a strange encounter in a restaurant, no longer something I could file away as an unusual night and move on from. Because whatever had started back there had followed me out into the street, into my life, into something I had not chosen but could not ignore. I did not do anything, I said, the words coming out quieter now, less certain, and for the first time, something in his expression softened, not visibly, not in a way most people would notice, but enough that I felt it more than saw it. You were there, he replied, and that was it. No accusation, no explanation, just a statement that carried more weight than anything else he could have said, because being there had been enough. Being seen had been enough, and I realized then that this was the part no one tells you. The moment when your life shifts not because of something you chose, but because of something you witnessed without understanding its cost. The car slowed as we approached an intersection, the red light casting a muted glow across the interior, and for a brief second, everything felt suspended, like time had paused just long enough for me to understand what I had stepped into. 5 minutes, he reminded me, glancing at me now, his gaze steady, unhurried. We are almost there. And I knew, even before I asked, even before I saw where we were going, that wherever there was would not be somewhere I could simply walk away from unchanged. The car did not stop where I expected it to, not near my apartment, not near anything familiar, but somewhere quieter, somewhere the city seemed to fade into something more controlled, more intentional, and when it finally slowed to a stop in front of a building that looked more like a private residence than anything public, I felt that same tight pull in my chest, the kind that comes when you realize you are far outside the lines of your normal life. I looked out the window, taking in the details without meaning to, the clean sidewalk, the subtle lighting, the absence of noise that usually filled every corner of the city, and it struck me how different this place felt from where I had just been, like stepping from one world into another without any warning. The engine turned off, but neither of us moved right away, and the silence that followed was not uncomfortable, just heavy, like it was waiting for me to decide something I had not fully put into words yet. 5 minutes, he said again, reminding me without pressure, without urgency, like time itself bent slightly around him, and I nodded before I could stop myself, the agreement coming easier than I expected, which only made me more aware of how quickly things were shifting. When I stepped out of the car, the air felt different, cooler, cleaner, and I wrapped my arms around myself out of habit, not from the temperature, but from the awareness of where I was, of who I was standing next to, of how far this had already gone. He walked beside me, not ahead, not behind, just there, close enough that I could feel his presence without him needing to touch me, and that balance unsettled me more than if he had tried to lead, because it made it feel like I was choosing each step instead of being pulled into it. Inside, the space was quiet, polished, every detail intentional, from the soft lighting to the way everything seemed placed with purpose, and I became suddenly aware of how out of place I must look, my worn jacket, my tired eyes, the kind of details that never mattered until you stood somewhere that made them impossible to ignore. You can sit, he said, gesturing toward a chair near a large window, his voice the same steady tone that had not changed since the moment I met him, and I hesitated for a second before doing as he said, not because I felt ordered to, but because refusing felt unnecessary, like pushing against something that was not trying to force me. He did not sit right away. Instead, he moved across the room, pouring water into a glass and setting it down in front of me without a word, a small gesture that felt strangely grounding, like a reminder that not everything about this moment had to be overwhelming. You said 5 minutes. I reminded him, my voice quieter now, more controlled, as if matching his tone would help me understand him better, and he nodded once, acknowledging it without argument. Then I will not waste them, he replied, and for the first time, there was a shift, not in his posture, not in his voice, but in the focus behind his eyes, like whatever came next mattered more than everything before it. The men who followed you are not interested in you, he said, and I felt a small, immediate relief that I did not trust, because it came too quickly, too easily. They are interested in me. The relief faded just as fast, replaced by something more complicated, something that made the situation feel both simpler and more dangerous at the same time. Then why was I followed? I asked, leaning forward slightly without realizing it, drawn in despite myself, and he held my gaze in a way that made it impossible to look away. Because you were seen with me, he answered, and the words settled with a quiet finality that left no room for misunderstanding, no space to pretend this was still separate from my life. I let out a slow breath, trying to process it, trying to find the edge of it, the point where I could step back and say this is where it ends. But that line was already behind me. So what happens now? The question came out before I could filter it, and for the first time, he did not answer immediately, which made me realize the answer was not simple, not something that could be reduced to a single sentence or a quick reassurance. Instead, he moved closer, not enough to invade my space, just enough that I could see the details I had missed before, the faint lines near his eyes, the subtle tension held beneath control, the kind that suggested he carried more than he showed. Now, he said finally, his voice lower, more deliberate. You decide if you want to be protected or if you want to pretend this will go away on its own. The words were not a threat. They were not a promise. They were something else entirely, something that felt like truth without comfort, and I realized then that this was the real choice he had been offering from the beginning, not whether to get into the car, not whether to sit in this room, but whether to accept that my life had already changed the moment I stepped into his line of sight. I looked down at my hands, still wrapped around the glass he had given me, and noticed they were not shaking anymore, not like before, and that steadiness surprised me, because it meant some part of me had already started to adapt, to adjust, to consider something I had not allowed myself to think about until now. When I looked back up at him, the question was still there, waiting, unchanged, and for the first time, I understood that whatever answer I gave would not just affect tonight. It would shape everything that came after, and that realization settled quietly between us, heavier than anything either of us had said. I should have said no. That is the answer that would have kept my life simple, predictable, safe in the quiet way I had always understood safety. But as I sat there with his question hanging between us, I realized something I had not been willing to admit before, that the version of safety I knew had already been broken the moment those footsteps followed me down the street, the moment his world brushed against mine and did not let go. I lifted my gaze to meet his again, searching for something that would make the decision easier, some sign that he was exaggerating, that this was all just caution taken too far, but there was nothing uncertain in his expression, no hesitation, no attempt to persuade me with anything other than the truth as he saw it. And if I say no? I asked, my voice steady in a way that surprised me, because the question mattered more than I was ready to show, and for a brief second, the room felt smaller, like everything had narrowed down to this single exchange. He did not answer right away. Instead, he studied me, not in a way that felt invasive, but in a way that felt precise, like he was measuring something beyond my words, something deeper than the surface reaction. Then I will make sure you get home tonight, he said finally, his tone unchanged, calm and even. And after that, you will be on your own. There was no threat in it, no hidden meaning, just a simple statement of consequence, and somehow that made it heavier than anything else he could have said, because it meant he was not trying to trap me, not trying to control the outcome, only laying out the reality as it stood. I nodded slowly, absorbing that, letting it settle, and for a moment, I imagined what that would look like, walking back into my apartment, closing the door, telling myself it was over, that whatever had happened could be ignored if I just refused to engage with it. But the image did not feel convincing, not anymore, not after everything he had already shown me. And if I say yes? The question came softer this time, less defensive, more honest, and something shifted in his eyes, not a smile, not relief, but recognition, like I had reached the point he had been waiting for without needing to push me there. Then you do not walk alone again, he replied, and the simplicity of it caught me off guard, because I had expected something more complicated, more demanding, something that would reveal the cost of what he was offering. But he did not elaborate, did not dress it up with promises or conditions, just left it there for me to understand on my own. I looked down at the glass in my hands, the water untouched, my reflection faintly visible on the surface, and I barely recognized the girl staring back, not because she looked different, but because something inside her had shifted, something that could not be undone by pretending this was still the same life she had yesterday. I had always believed that independence meant handling everything alone, that accepting help came with strings that would eventually tighten. But sitting there, faced with a reality I could not control, I began to understand that sometimes the choice was not between dependence and independence, but between awareness and denial. "I do not belong in your world," I said quietly, the truth of it grounding me even as everything else felt uncertain. And for the first time, his expression changed in a way I could clearly see, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to feel the weight behind his response before he even spoke. "You are already in it," he said, and there was no arrogance in the statement, no claim of ownership, just an acknowledgement of something that had already happened, something neither of us could reverse. The room fell quiet again, but this time it felt different, less like waiting and more like understanding, like the space between us had settled into something clearer, something defined. I exhaled slowly, the tension I had been holding in my chest easing just enough for me to think without reacting. And when I looked back up at him, the answer was already there, not fully formed, not completely certain, but present in a way that made it impossible to ignore. "I do not want to be protected because I am afraid," I said, choosing my words carefully, because they mattered more now than they had before. "I want to understand what I am stepping into." For a brief second, something in his gaze sharpened, not in warning, but in approval, like I had shifted the terms of the conversation in a way he respected. "Then you will," he replied, and there was something final in the way he said it, something that told me this was no longer just about getting through the night, but about what came after. He stepped back slightly, giving me space without breaking the connection entirely, and for the first time since I had entered the room, I felt like I was not being pulled into something unknown, but stepping toward it on my own terms, even if I did not fully understand what those terms would become. "So this is your answer?" he asked, not pressing, just confirming, and I nodded, the movement small but certain, because even if I could not see the full path ahead, I knew standing still was no longer an option. "Yes," I said, the word quieter than I expected, but stronger than anything I had said that night. And as soon as it left my lips, I felt it, the shift, not around me this time, but inside me, like a door had opened that I could not close again. And somewhere in that realization, I understood something else, something I had not considered until that moment, that the man standing in front of me had not just changed the direction of my life. He had given me a choice I did not know I needed, and whether that choice would save me or unravel. Everything I had built was something I would only discover by stepping forward. The word yes did not echo the way I expected it to. It did not sound loud or final or dramatic. It simply settled between us like something that had been waiting to exist long before I said it. And for a moment, nothing changed, not the room, not the air, not even the way he stood in front of me, but I felt it anyway, that quiet shift that happens when a decision moves from thought into reality. He nodded once, not in approval, not in satisfaction, just acknowledgement, like this was exactly where the moment had always been leading. "Then we start with something simple," he said, and the calm in his voice grounded me more than anything else he had said so far, because it suggested structure, intention, something that could be understood step by step instead of all at once. "You do not go back alone tonight." I opened my mouth to respond, to argue that I had been fine before, that I could handle myself the way I always had, but the words stopped before they formed, because we both knew that was no longer true, not after everything he had already explained. Instead, I nodded, the motion small but deliberate, and he turned slightly, reaching for his phone, speaking in a low voice I could not fully hear, just enough to understand that whatever he said in motion moved quickly, efficiently, without hesitation. It was not chaotic. It was not loud. It was controlled, and that control was what made it feel so different from anything I had experienced before. "You live 6 blocks from the restaurant," he said after ending the call, his eyes returning to me, and the fact that he knew that without asking made something tighten in my chest, not fear exactly, but awareness, the realization that he had already been paying attention in ways I had not noticed. Third floor, apartment facing the street, he added, and this time I could not hide my reaction, the slight shift in my posture, the instinctive need to reclaim something private that had already been seen. That is not information I gave you, I said, my voice quieter now, not accusing, just stating the obvious, and for a second, the corner of his expression changed, not quite a smile, but something close to understanding. No, he replied, but it is information I needed. The simplicity of that answer unsettled me more than if he had tried to justify it, because it meant this was normal for him, knowing details, mapping out the world around him in ways that left little to chance. You said I would not be controlled, I reminded him, holding on to that part of the conversation like it mattered more now than it had before, and he did not look away, did not deflect. You are not, he said, his voice steady, but protection requires awareness. I let that sit for a moment, turning it over in my mind, testing it against what I understood, against what I had always believed about independence and boundaries, and I realized something uncomfortable, that there was a difference between being controlled and being considered, and I was not sure yet where he stood between those two lines. You will have someone near you, he continued, not asking, just informing, not inside your space, not interfering, just present. I frowned slightly, the idea of being watched sitting somewhere between reassurance and discomfort, and he seemed to catch that immediately. You will not see them unless you need to, he added, and something about the way he said it made me believe him, even if I did not fully understand how that would work. And if I decide I do not want that? I asked, pushing once more, not because I expected a different answer, but because I needed to know where the limits were, where my choices still mattered. He paused for a fraction of a second, just enough to acknowledge the question as real. Then you tell me, he said, and we adjust. There was no argument, no resistance, and that response disarmed me more than anything else, because it meant he was not trying to force me into something fixed, but rather into something that could shift with me, and that flexibility was not what I expected from someone like him. The room felt quieter again, but not heavy this time, just steady, like the ground beneath me had leveled out enough for me to stand without bracing for impact. Tonight, he said after a moment, bringing the focus back, you go home, you rest, and tomorrow we begin to make sure what happened does not happen again. The way he said tomorrow made it sound like something structured, something planned, not just a vague continuation of uncertainty, and I realized then that this was how he operated, not reacting, but preparing, not waiting, but anticipating. And you? I asked before I could stop myself, the question slipping out without the usual filter I relied on, and for the first time, there was a brief pause in him, not hesitation, but consideration, like he was deciding how much to say. I will be where I need to be, he answered, and it was not an evasion, not exactly, but it was not a full answer either, and I understood that some parts of his world were not things he would explain easily, not yet. I nodded slowly, accepting that for now, and stood, the movement feeling different than it had earlier, less uncertain, more grounded, like I was no longer reacting to everything around me, but moving with it in some small way. He stepped aside as I moved toward the door, not blocking, not guiding, just allowing the space to exist, and that simple act made something in me settle, because it reminded me that despite everything, despite how far this had gone in such a short time, I still had the ability to choose my steps. When we reached the car again, the city felt different than it had before, not quieter, not safer, but clearer, like I could see the edges of things I had not noticed before, and as I slid into the seat, I realized that the fear I had felt earlier had changed, not disappeared, but shifted into something else, something closer to awareness, something sharper, more focused. He did not speak as the car pulled away, and neither did I, because there was nothing left to decide for tonight. Only the understanding that whatever came next would not be something I could walk away from unchanged, and somewhere in that silence, I realized something else, something I had not fully grasped until that moment. That saying yes had not just brought him into my life, it had placed me directly into his, and there was no part of that world that would ever be ordinary again. Sleep did not come easily that night, not because I was afraid in the way I had expected, but because my mind refused to slow down, replaying every word, every look, every moment that had led me here, and when I finally drifted off sometime close to 3 in the morning, it felt less like rest and more like a brief pause before something I could not yet see clearly. When I woke up, the light coming through my window was sharper than usual, cutting across the small room in a way that made everything look more defined, more real, and for a second, I wondered if I had imagined everything. If the night before had been some kind of vivid dream shaped by exhaustion and stress. But then I saw it. The envelope, still on my table, still unopened since I had put it down again after coming home. And just like that, everything came back. I sat up slowly, my eyes moving across the room, noticing details I had never paid attention to before, the angle of the door, the distance to the window, the faint sound of footsteps outside in the hallway, and it hit me how much more aware I felt, like something in me had shifted overnight, like I was no longer moving through my life on autopilot, but actually seeing it for what it was. I got dressed quickly, the routine grounding me in small ways, jeans, sweater, the same worn sneakers I had always relied on, but even those felt different now, like they belonged to a version of me that was already fading. When I stepped outside, the city greeted me the same way it always did, loud, busy, indifferent, but I did not feel invisible in it anymore. And that realization stayed with me as I walked the familiar 6 blocks toward the restaurant. Halfway there, I slowed. Not because I saw anything obvious, but because I felt it again, that subtle awareness of presence, not close enough to alarm me, not intrusive, just there, steady and consistent, and I did not turn around this time. I did not need to. I understood. He had kept his word. Someone was near. Not visible. Not interfering. Just present. And strangely, that did not scare me the way I thought it would. It grounded me. When I reached the restaurant, everything looked the same chipped counter, the same flickering light near the back, the same smell of coffee that had soaked into the walls over time. And for a moment, I wondered how something so familiar could feel so distant. "You look different," my coworker said as soon as I stepped behind the counter, her eyes narrowing slightly like she was trying to figure out what had changed, and I hesitated, unsure how to answer that. Because how do you explain a shift that is not visible, something internal, something that does not show in the mirror but changes the way you see everything around you? "Just tired," I said finally, falling back on the simplest explanation, and she did not look convinced, but she let it go, turning back to her tasks with a small shake of her head. The morning moved quickly, orders coming in, plates moving out, the rhythm of the place pulling me in the way it always had. But there was a distance now, a layer between me and the routine, like I was observing it instead of being fully inside it. And then, just after noon, it happened. Not something loud, not something dramatic, just a shift. The door opened, and the room changed. Conversations softened, not completely, but enough that I noticed, enough that it felt familiar in a way that made my pulse pick up before I even looked. I did not need to. I knew. Still, I turned, and there he was, standing just inside the entrance, dressed the same way he had been the night before, controlled, composed, like the world adjusted itself slightly to make space for him without him needing to ask. For a second, neither of us moved. The distance between us felt shorter than it was, like everything in the room had narrowed down to that single point of focus. And then he stepped forward, each movement deliberate, unhurried, until he stood in front of me at the counter. "You slept," he said, not as a question, just an observation, and I nodded before I could stop myself, caught off guard by how easily he read something so simple. "A little," I replied, my voice steady despite the way my heart had started to pick up again, and his gaze held mine for a moment longer than necessary, like he was confirming something beyond my words. "Good," he said quietly, and then, just as easily, he shifted the moment, stepping slightly to the side so he was no longer directly in front of me, no longer the center of attention in a way that would draw unnecessary eyes. "Walk with me when your shift ends," he added, his tone low enough that only I could hear, and it was not a request, not exactly, but it was not a command either, just a statement that assumed continuation. I hesitated, the instinct to question rising again, to push back, to reclaim some sense of control over how quickly this was moving. But before I could speak, he added one more thing, softer this time, almost like a reminder rather than an instruction. "There are things you need to understand." And just like that, I knew. This was not over. This was only the beginning. I spent the rest of my shift pretending everything was normal, but nothing felt normal anymore. Not the way the clock ticked slower than usual. Not the way every sound seemed sharper, more defined, like my senses had adjusted to something I could not turn off. And definitely not the way my thoughts kept circling back to his words. There are things you need to understand, because it did not sound like a warning. It sounded like preparation. I caught myself glancing at the door more than once, half expecting him to still be there, watching, waiting, but he had disappeared as quietly as he had arrived, leaving behind that same invisible shift in the room, like something had passed through and changed the air without leaving a trace. When my shift finally ended, I did not linger the way I usually did not chat, did not stretch out the last few minutes to delay stepping back into the night, because this time, I knew someone was waiting, and that knowledge pulled me forward instead of holding me back. I stepped outside and saw the car immediately, parked along the curb like it had been there all day, blending in just enough to avoid attention, but still unmistakable if you knew what to look for. And for a brief second, I stood there, taking in the scene, the quiet street, the dim glow of the streetlights, the steady rhythm of the city continuing around us like nothing had changed, even though everything had. The passenger door opened before I reached it, not abruptly, not in a way that startled me, just smoothly, like the moment had already been decided, and I slid inside without hesitation this time. The movement easier than it had been the night before, which should have concerned me more than it did. He was already there, sitting in the same composed stillness, his presence filling the space without effort, and when the door closed behind me, the outside world faded again, replaced by that controlled quiet that seemed to follow him wherever he went. "You came," he said, not surprised, just acknowledging, and I let out a small breath I had not realized I was holding. "You said there were things I needed to understand," I replied, meeting his gaze directly this time. No hesitation, no deflection, and something in his expression shifted, not visibly, but enough that I felt it, like he recognized the change in me as clearly as I recognized it in myself. The car moved before he spoke again, pulling away from the curb with that same smooth precision, and I noticed how natural it felt now, being here, sitting beside him, like the unfamiliar had already started to become routine. "Understanding begins with perspective," he said finally, his voice low, steady, the same tone that never seemed to rise or fall, but still carried weight, and I turned slightly toward him, focusing on every word because I had learned quickly that nothing he said was accidental. "The world you know," he continued, "is built on what you can see, what you can control, what you believe is predictable." I nodded faintly, following his logic, even if I did not yet see where it was leading. "My world," he added, after a brief pause, "is built on what others do not see, what they underestimate, what they ignore until it is too late." The words settled between us, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just clear, and I felt the difference immediately, not just in the way he described it, but in the way I had already experienced it without realizing it. "So where do I fit into that?" I asked, the question coming naturally now, not defensive, not afraid, just seeking clarity, and he turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting mine with that same steady focus that never wavered. "Right now," he said, "you are the point where those two worlds intersect." I let that sink in, the weight of it heavier than I expected, because it meant I was not just observing something different, I was part of it, whether I had intended to be or not. And the people who followed me, I pressed, needing to understand that piece more than anything else, because it was the part that made this real, the part that made this more than just a conversation. "They are watching for weakness," he replied, his tone unchanged, "for anything that can be used to disrupt what I have built." I felt a chill at that, not from fear exactly, but from the clarity of it, the way he reduced something complex into something simple, something understandable. "And they think I am that weakness?" I asked, and for the first time, there was a subtle shift in him, something closer to disagreement than confirmation. "They think you are access," he corrected, and that distinction mattered more than I expected, because it meant I was not the target, but I was not safe either. I looked out the window for a moment, watching the city pass by, the lights, the movement, the life that continued without noticing the shift happening inside me. And I realized something then, something I had not fully accepted until now, that this was no longer about whether I belonged in his world or not. It was about the fact that I was already standing at its edge, and stepping back was no longer as simple as turning around. So what do I need to understand? I asked quietly, turning back to him, ready this time, not just to listen, but to learn, and his gaze held mine for a moment longer before he answered, his voice steady, deliberate, like every word was chosen for a reason. You need to understand, he said, that from this moment forward, nothing around you is accidental. And as the car continued through the city, the weight of that truth settled into place, changing the way I saw everything, not just him, not just his world, but my own. Nothing around you is accidental. His words stayed with me long after he said them, echoing in the quiet spaces between passing streetlights and the soft hum of the car as it moved through the city, and I found myself looking at everything differently. The people on the sidewalks, the cars at intersections, even the way reflections shifted in the glass, like the world had always been layered, and I had only just learned how to see beyond the surface. Then teach me, I said after a moment, my voice steady, not because I felt certain, but because I understood that hesitation would not change what was already in motion, and he glanced at me briefly, something unreadable passing through his expression before his attention returned to the road ahead. Observation first, he replied, simple, direct, like everything else about him, and I leaned back slightly, letting that settle, letting my mind adjust to the idea that this was no longer just about reacting, but about learning how to see. The car slowed as we turned onto a quieter street, one I did not recognize, lined with buildings that looked polished, intentional, the kind of places that did not advertise themselves but did not need to. And when we stopped, I felt that same subtle tension return, not fear, not exactly, just awareness, like I was stepping into another layer of something I was only beginning to understand. He stepped out first this time, not to lead, but to move with purpose, and I followed. The night air cooler here, the sounds of the city more distant, like we had shifted slightly out of its center without leaving it entirely. Watch, he said quietly as we walked, and I focused, not just on what was obvious, but on the spaces between things, the pauses, the patterns, the way a man across the street checked his watch twice in less than a minute, the way a car idled a little too long before moving on, the way someone standing near a doorway adjusted their position when we passed, subtle movements, easy to miss if you were not looking for them. They are not all threats, he continued, his voice low enough that it did not carry beyond us, but they are all pieces. I frowned slightly, trying to connect what I was seeing with what he was saying, and he slowed his pace just enough for me to keep up without rushing. Most people move through their lives assuming everything around them is random, he added, but patterns exist everywhere. I nodded faintly, beginning to understand, not fully, but enough to see the outline of what he meant, and it changed something in me. The way I held myself, the way I looked at the world, like I was no longer just passing through it, but reading it in a way I had not before. We stopped near the corner, the streetlight casting a soft glow over the pavement, and he turned slightly toward me, not fully, just enough that I could see the shift in his focus again. Earlier today, he said, you felt someone near you. It was not a question, and I nodded, remembering the quiet awareness that had followed me without revealing itself. That was not coincidence, he continued. It was placement. The word landed differently, heavier, more intentional, and I felt it settle into the framework he had been building, each piece connecting to the next in a way that made the whole picture clearer. Everything around you now is part of a structure, he said, including you. I inhaled slowly, letting that sink in, because it meant I was no longer separate from what I was observing. I was part of it, a variable in something much larger than I had considered before. And if I make a mistake? I asked, the question coming quieter this time, not out of fear, but out of awareness of what I did not yet know. And he looked at me fully then, his gaze steady, direct, the kind that did not allow for misunderstanding. Then you learn from it, he replied, and there was something firm in that answer. Something that did not promise safety but did promise growth, and for some reason, that mattered more. The city moved around us, unchanged on the surface, but different in the way I now perceived it, every detail sharper, every movement more deliberate, and I realized then that this was what he meant, not just protection, not just awareness, but transformation, the slow shift from someone who reacted to someone who understood. Why me? I asked after a moment, the question that had been sitting beneath everything else finally finding its way out. And he did not answer immediately, his silence stretching just long enough to make me think he might not answer at all. But then he spoke, his voice quieter than before, but no less certain. "Because you noticed," he said, and I blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of it, because I had not thought of myself that way, had not considered that something as small as paying attention could be the reason I was here, standing in a world I had never intended to enter. "Most people look," he continued, "but they do not see." I held his gaze, the weight of that statement settling into something deeper than I expected, and for the first time since all of this began, I felt something shift that was not driven by fear or uncertainty, but by something else, something quieter, stronger. Understanding. The night air moved gently around us, the city continuing its endless rhythm, but I no longer felt like I was just a part of it, unnoticed and unaffected. I felt like I was standing at the edge of something that had already begun to change me in ways I could not fully measure yet. And as I looked at him, really looked this time, I realized something that had not been clear before, something that settled into place with a quiet certainty that matched his own. He had not just saved me, he had changed the way I saw everything. And whether I was ready or not, I was not going back to who I was before.